Here are the most disturbing jobs people actually used to have for money. Picture this. You're standing over a freshly dead body, and someone hands you a piece of bread. Your job? Place it on the corpse's chest, eat it, and congratulations, you've just absorbed all of their sins. Welcome to the glamorous career of a sign eater, possibly the most depressing gig in human history. Sign eaters emerged in Wales and parts of England during the 17th and 18th centuries, back when people genuinely believed that eating food placed on a dead person would transfer their sins from the deceased to the eater. The logic was simple and completely unhinged. Grandma died with a soul full of lies, adultery, and maybe some light murder? No problem. Just hire the local sign eater to come munch some bread off her corpse, and boom, she's heaven-bound while this poor guy shoulders her eternal damnation. The sign eater was typically the most destitute person in the village. Someone so desperate, so outcast, that eating cursed bread off dead bodies for a few coins seemed like a reasonable career path. They'd be summoned to a home where a body lay waiting, and the family would place a piece of bread and a bowl of beer on the deceased's chest. The sign eater would consume both, while everyone watched in horrified silence. Sometimes they'd throw in a coin or two, sometimes just the bread. Either way, the sign eater walked away with a full stomach, a few pennies, and the spiritual baggage of every terrible thing that person had ever done. Here's the kicker. Because they were believed to be carrying everyone else's sins, sign eaters were treated like walking plague rats. They lived on the outskirts of town, avoided by everyone. Children would run away, screaming. Adults wouldn't make eye contact. They were necessary for the community's spiritual hygiene, but absolutely reviled for doing the job. It's like being an essential worker during a pandemic, except instead of inadequate hazard pay, you get eternal damnation and social exile. The last known sign eater in England died in 1906, taking with him the sins of countless strangers and probably some serious digestive issues. Speaking of terrible ways to make a living, let's descend into the literal sewers. Victorian London had a bit of a problem. The city was growing faster than its infrastructure could handle, and the sewers were overflowing with human waste, dead animals, and basically everything else you can imagine rotting in underground tunnels. But where most people saw a putrid nightmare, some enterprising individuals saw opportunity. Enter the Toshers professional sewer scavengers, who waded through rivers of sewage looking for treasure. Toshers would enter the sewers through the tide gates or riverside entrances, usually working in the dead of night to avoid being caught by authorities. Because yes, this job was technically illegal. Armed with a long pole, a lantern, and an absolutely destroyed sense of smell, they trudged through waist-deep sewage looking for anything valuable that had been flushed or washed away. Coins, jewelry, silverware, bones that could be sold to glue factories, pieces of metal, rope, anything that could be cleaned off and sold. The work was spectacularly dangerous. The sewers were filled with toxic gases that could knock you unconscious or straight up kill you. Rats the size of cats swarmed everywhere. And not the cute cartoon kind, the kind with rabies and a taste for human flesh. The tunnels could flood without warning during heavy rains, drowning anyone caught inside. And there were stories, probably exaggerated but delightfully creepy, of giant super rats that had grown fat on sewage and developed a taste for human flesh, attacking Toshers in the dark. Some Toshers reportedly went mad from the fumes and were found wandering the tunnels, babbling about underground kingdoms and treasure beyond imagination. Spoiler, it was just sewage. It was always just sewage. Despite the risks, some Toshers actually made decent money. A good night's haul could net more than a week's wages in a factory. But the trade-off was wading through literal human waste, breathing poisonous air, and the very real possibility of being eaten by a plague rat or drowning in a river of Victorian diarrhea. The practice died out as London modernized its sewer system and increased enforcement, but for a brief, horrifying period, sewer scavenger was an actual career path. Now, if you thought eating sins off corpses or swimming in sewage was bad, wait until you hear about the leech collectors. Before modern medicine, doctors were obsessed with bloodletting. Got a fever? Bleed it out. Headache? Bleed it out. Stubbed your toe? You guessed it, apply leeches and bleed it out. This created a massive demand for medical leeches, and someone had to collect them. That someone was usually a poor woman who really, really needed money. Here's how it worked. Leech collectors would wade into ponds, marshes, and swamps, preferably ones known to have lots of leeches, and just stand there, barefoot, bare-legged. Sometimes they'd churn the water or splash around to attract the leeches, like the world's worst pool party. Then they'd wait for the leeches to latch onto their skin and start feeding. Once the leeches were nice and full of the collector's blood, they'd pluck them off, drop them in a bag, and repeat the process until they'd collected enough to sell or until they passed out from blood loss, whichever came first. The job was predominantly done by women and children because they were paid less and society has always been garbage. A collector might stand in freezing, disgusting water for hours, letting dozens of leeches drain their blood, all for a few coins. The real horror wasn't just the leeches themselves, though getting bitten by blood-sucking worms is obviously terrible, but the infections. Dirty water plus open wounds equals sepsis, gangrene, and all sorts of nightmare infections that could kill you in an era before antibiotics. There are documented cases of leech collectors dying from blood loss or infection. Others developed chronic health problems from repeated exposure to filthy water and blood drain. But hey, at least doctors got their precious leeches to perform completely ineffective treatments on patients who probably just needed some rest and clean water. The profession died out as leech therapy fell out of favor and people realized that maybe, just maybe, there were better ways to collect medical supplies than turning human beings into living bait. But wait, there's more. Someone had to clean the cesspits. In medieval and early modern cities, people didn't have flush toilets. They had cesspits, basically giant holes in the ground, where all human waste collected. And when those pits filled up, which they did constantly, someone had to climb down into them and shovel out the contents. That someone was called a Gong Farmer, and their life was exactly as terrible as you're imagining. Gong Farmers worked at night, partly because the smell was slightly less overwhelming in cooler temperatures, but mostly because the sight and smell of their work would cause riots if done during the day. They'd remove the cover of a cesspit, climb down into a literal pool of human excrement, sometimes 10 feet deep, and manually shovel it into buckets that would be hauled up and carted away. The waste, called night soil, would be sold to farmers as fertilizer because nothing says fresh vegetables like growing them in human feces. The pay was actually quite good because absolutely nobody wanted this job. In some cities, Gong farmers earned more than skilled tradesmen, but the trade-offs were biblical. The toxic fumes in cesspits could kill you instantly. Methane buildup could cause explosions. Workers could slip and drown in sewage, which is objectively the worst possible way to die. And even if you survived, you were permanently marked by the smell. No amount of bathing could completely remove it. Gong farmers lived in isolation, avoided by everyone, their very presence causing people to retch. There are records of Gong farmers dying in spectacularly awful ways. One famous case from 1326 involved a Gong farmer named Richard the Raker, who fell through a rotted plank into his own cesspit and drowned in it. The coroner's report is still preserved today, a permanent record of the absolute worst way to die. The profession persisted until modern plumbing made it obsolete, which couldn't have come soon enough for literally everyone involved. Finally, let's talk about the resurrection men. In the 18th and 19th centuries, medical schools desperately needed cadavers for anatomy lessons. The problem? There weren't enough legal bodies to go around. Executed criminals were fair game, but there simply weren't enough hangings to meet demand. So a cottage industry emerged. Body snatchers, also called resurrection men, who would dig up freshly buried corpses and sell them to medical schools, no questions asked. These weren't mass vigilantes or noble scientists advancing medicine. They were usually criminals who saw an opportunity for easy money. They'd scout graveyards, noting recent burials, then return at night with shovels and a complete lack of moral compass. The technique was efficient and disturbing. They'd dig down to the head of the coffin, break it open, and use a rope or hook to drag the body out by the neck or head, minimizing the time spent digging. Bodies were worth more intact, so they'd strip off any jewelry or clothing. Stealing from a grave was a serious crime, but stealing a body was only a misdemeanor legal loophole, and stuff the naked corpse into a sack. The most famous resurrection men were William Burke and William Hare in Edinburgh. though they took the job to its logical, horrifying conclusion by cutting out the middleman and just murdering people to sell fresh corpses. They killed at least 16 people before being caught. Burke was executed, and, in a delicious twist of irony, his body was given to medical schools for dissection. His skeleton is still on display in Edinburgh. Hare turned informant and disappeared into history. Body snatching became such a problem that families would hire guards to watch graves, install iron cages over burial plots, or bury their loved ones in concrete vaults. Some graveyards installed mort safes, heavy iron frameworks placed over graves until the body decomposed enough to be worthless to medical schools. The practice largely ended with the Anatomy Act of 1832, which gave medical schools legal access to unclaimed bodies, making grave robbing obsolete. But for decades, resurrection men prowled cemeteries, turning grief into profit and corpses into commodities. So there you have it. 5 jobs that make your worst Monday look like a spa day. Sign eaters dining on damnation, Toshers swimming in sewage, Leech Collectors turned into human blood bags, Gong Farmers drowning in medieval toilets, and resurrection men robbing graves for beer money. These people didn't choose these jobs because they wanted to. They did it because they had to survive in a world that gave them absolutely no better options. Which one freaked you out the most? The spiritual horror of the sign eater, the biological nightmare of the leech collector, or the sheer physical disgust of the gong farmer? Let me know in the comments. As always, thank you very much for watching. My name is Dr. Hollowstone, and I am really smart. Until next time, farewell.